On your mark, get set, go. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome to the Heartland Cafe. I know many of you have been here before. Those of you who haven't, we hope you have a wonderful time. We're really honored today to have Gordon Mantler, a sociologist out of Duke University who has a new book called Power to the Poor, Black-Brown Coalition and the Fight for Economic Justice. And he covers the Poor People's Campaign. He touches on the Rainbow Coalition here in Chicago, which those of you who've been around the Heartland know that we talk it up a lot. The Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, Rising Up Angry, a little bit of the American Indian movement. And the work that went on back then, I think, led to the election of Harold Washington. Harold Washington's election led to Barack Obama coming to town, and now he is our president. He, too, has graced this stage when he was running for the Senate. We hope, I hope that the things Gordon talks about will strike a chord with all of us, because we know that the issues that we fought way back in the old days are still with us today. And whatever we can glean from Gordon's analysis and his insights will certainly go a long way to continuing the ongoing struggle for not only justice, but a better life, a better world for many people. And like we always say on our radio show live from the Heartland, do good in the world needs all the good that you do. And here is Gordon Mandler. Glad to have you, Gordon.
Hey. That is loud. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the Heartland for having me here, and for you guys for coming out this afternoon. It's a beautiful, beautiful day here in Chicago, and the Blues Festival is going on, the Book Festival is going on, the Cubs and Sox are both playing, the Blackhawks just went to, just made it into the championship, and so there's a lot of reason not to be here. So I appreciate you guys being here today and sticking it out with me. And again, I want to thank Mike and the Heartland for having me both on the radio show yesterday, as well as here this afternoon. So well, thank you. So my plan is to talk for 35 minutes or so, something along those lines. Read some excerpts from the book, and then open it up to a conversation about the key issues at the heart of the book, as well as the implications for the book that the book deals with, implications for the 21st century, and what we're dealing with here in Chicago and elsewhere when it's around multiracial coalition building and the politics of today. So, and then of course after that, I'm happy to sign. I need to have it. I don't want to talk that loud. Really? Oh man. I'll be happy to sign and sell some books at the end if you're interested. So, so this year is a pretty important year when it comes to the freedom struggle and the public memory and commemoration of the freedom struggle. If you think about it, 50 years ago, 1963, we had the Birmingham campaign, which led directly to John F. Kennedy's civil rights address in early June. We're right about to get to the 50th anniversary of it. Of course, the assassination of Medgar Evers in Mississippi was 50 years ago this month. So all of these things were happening in '63. But I think more than any other event that we remember, and we'll certainly remember later this summer, is the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, the commemoration around that. And I'm pretty certain that the memory is going to focus on Dr. Martin Luther King and is going to focus on the I Have a Dream speech. So there's Dr. King on the march. And there's a reason why this speech is going to get a lot of focus. It was a great speech. It was hopeful. It was optimistic. It's beautifully delivered. Great, cadence and delivery and emotional appeal. It's possible that a more sophisticated understanding of the March on Washington in '63 will emerge later this summer in public commemorations, that it was a labor action that was mostly organized by labor unions and activists like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. It's possible that the full title of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, will be used, although we usually know it as the March on Washington and just that. And we may also hear a little bit about the terror that the Kennedy administration had for this march, in the sense that hundreds of thousands of African Americans are going to descend on the Washington Mall, to the point where the government shut down most of the government except for essential personnel that day. That's not what we normally hear. Maybe we'll hear that, but I think there's a pretty good chance that it's mostly going to focus on the actual "I Have a Dream" speech. And as I said, it's a great speech, and we probably know most of it by heart, or at least parts of it by heart, because it's ingrained in us every January and February through popular culture, school textbooks, public speeches by politicians. It's, as I said, it's a great speech, but it risks obscuring the complexity of Dr. Martin Luther King by freezing him at this time in '63. And so it obscures the complexity of the man, it obscures the complexity of the movement, and it obscures the complexity of the 1960s. So this afternoon, I want to talk about a march that Dr. King envisioned but never saw, and that's the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 that happened in May and June and July of 1968 after his death. But we are in Chicago, and so I wanted to give us a little bit of background. Most of you in the room probably know about this, of course. This is the march, one of the big anti-war, anti-Vietnam War marches on State Street in 1967. So 2 years earlier, Dr. King, of course, comes to Chicago and leads the Chicago Freedom Movement at the behest of Al Raby and other activists who were part of the CCCO here in Chicago, the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations, which had led for several years a fight against school segregation and residential segregation. And the goal that Dr. King had was to crack what had been considered the most residentially segregated city in the country. Not in the South, but in Chicago. The Civil Rights Commission in the late 50s had declared Chicago the most segregated city in the country. And with the hopes that if you can crack Chicago, you can crack anywhere. And if you convince Mayor Daley, the older Mayor Daley, Richard J., that open housing is the best policy, then it will happen everywhere, whether it's Detroit or Los Angeles or Boston or New York or throughout the South. And the other idea, another reason for doing this was Dr. King was also very concerned about the rebellions that were occurring in cities across the country. In Harlem, and certainly in 1965 in South Central Los Angeles in the Watts area. And so the decision to go to Chicago was won by invitation by Al Raby here on in the striped tie right there, but also with this larger idea that we have to be able to restore hope in the cities, and that the Voting Rights Act that had just been passed and the Civil Rights Act of '64 really only applied to African Americans for the most part in the South. And it didn't really bring about change in the North and in the West. And it's one of the reasons why you saw the rebellions that occurred in the mid to late '60s. So, of course, the Chicago Freedom Movement, again, you guys probably know most of this, didn't really accomplish what it had all hoped, it was hoped to do. The Summit Agreement, brokered by Dr. King, Mayor Daley, and several other folks, including the head of the Realtors here in Chicago, brokered a deal that was a lot of promises that were never met. But I would argue that the Chicago Freedom Movement built and solidified an infrastructure that made it possible for the Poor People's Campaign to reach as many people as it did. And as I say in the book, Chicago provides more people for the Poor People's Campaign a year and a half later, in the spring of '68, than any other city in the country. And a lot of that has to do with the freedom movement. The relationships that Dr. King makes with gang members, including the Blackstone Rangers, the relationships that he makes with folks in Uptown and on the North Side, like Peggy Terry and the Joint Community Union, and the Latin American Defense Organization led by Obed Lopez, who's is still around today. And as well as the infrastructure that Operation Breadbasket represented, emerges from the Chicago Freedom Movement in '66. So by late '67, King was alarmed by what he saw in the cities, and specifically the vicious circle of state violence that was occurring, both in the cities, police brutality and harassment, as well as overseas, military involvement in Southeast Asia, as well as a response by black rioters who were frustrated with the slow pace of change, if any change at all. Again, remember, the Southern movement, while inspiring to the rest of the country, for the most part did not touch the rest of the country when it came to the policy and the ingrained segregation that you had in places like Chicago. So, and the concern for King in the long run was that this vicious circle of violence would eventually lead to fascism, and that the state, that we would, the response to urban rioting would be so over the top that we would be in lead to a fascist state. So, in December, he announces the Poor People's Campaign, in which his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, would bring, quote, waves of the nation's poor, this is Dr. King's words, waves of the nation's poor and disinherited to Washington, D.C. to demand redress of their grievances by the government and to secure at least jobs or income for all, adding that the poor would stay until America responds. But he envisioned the campaign as not just a black and white, but also a campaign that included Puerto Ricans, that included Mexican Americans, that included Native Americans, an early rainbow coalition. And this is a term, of course, we use a lot, whether it's in terms of Fred Hampton, like Mike mentioned before, or of course Jesse Jackson's popularization of the term in the '80s. But he also hoped that the campaign would do three things. One, transform fully the struggle for civil rights and the human rights. This is already occurring, but he wants the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to be at the forefront of that process. Second, to bring about the federal government's rededication to the war on poverty, which had been declared 4 years earlier by President Lyndon Johnson in '64, but had never been fully fought or fully funded. And three, to restore the credibility of nonviolence and direct action, which had really lost ground amid calls for any means necessary in armed self-defense, which are black power slogans. So that leads to my first excerpt. I'm going to try to do this one-handed. The crusade blossomed into the most ambitious campaign ever undertaken by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The campaign, which King did not live to see, has been dismissed by journalists, scholars, King biographers, and even some activists as either irrelevant or a disastrous coda of the black freedom struggle. One former SCLC official referred to the campaign as the, quote, little bighorn of the civil rights movement, an eye-catching but imprecise analogy. If you think about it, it's not clear who General Custer is in that analogy. And is that SCLC or who? And in fact, the campaign was deeply flawed in many ways and often was preoccupied with symbolism. It did not spark a new war on poverty. It did not reinvigorate nonviolent strategy. And it did not achieve many of SCLC's stated policy goals, including a New Deal-style jobs program. Yet a closer look at the campaign reveals a unique and remarkably instructive experiment to build a multiracial movement designed to wage a sustained fight against poverty. Even amid the cacophony of assassinations and political turmoil that spring, the campaign captured the nation's attention and imagination. Only in Washington in the spring of '68 did local, regional, and national activists of so many different backgrounds, from veterans of the labor and Southern civil rights movements to activists of the newer Chicano, American Indian, anti-war, and welfare rights struggles, attempt to construct a physical and spiritual community explicitly about justice and poverty that went beyond a one-day rally. By bringing such a diverse array of activists together from across the country, the campaign highlighted how multiracial coalitional politics operate alongside the identity politics of Black and Chicano power. That relationship was messy at times and exacerbated by other forces, but ultimately activists such as Reyes Tijerina and Martin Luther King, Corky Gonzalez and Jesse Jackson, Maria Varela and Marian Wright, and thousands of others did not choose either identity politics or coalitional politics at this time. They chose both and participated in both. And so this last part, this relationship between class-based coalition and race-based identity, is central to the book. The public memory and much of historical scholarship, frankly, really breaks the decade down into two pieces. The good 1960s of the traditional civil rights coalition and Kennedy liberalism that supposedly devolves into the bad 1960s of Black power, conflict, urban uprisings, and identity politics. And, whoops, hold on for a second. In reality, coalition and conflict coexisted. And class and race at this time were not at odds with each other, but were mutually reinforcing, mutually interdependent. And I argued that the Poor People's Campaign represents just that relationship. So it takes months for folks outside the traditional civil rights circles to hear about the campaign, understand what the campaign was all about. And it's not until March of '68 when Dr. King invites some 80 activists from across the spectrum of the left to come to Atlanta for a one-day rally or one-day conference to find out what the campaign was all about. And whether or not their interests, their issues, the way they define poverty was going to be included. So this is a picture from that conference. Obviously Dr. King and Reyes Lopez Tijerina, the New Mexico leader, Chicano leader, who became a key spokesman for land grant rights going back to the 19th century, which was an issue that really motivated and energized people of Mexican descent when it came to their poverty, particularly in the Southwest. And what's interesting is just how many folks came and how many folks were in the same room together. And it's a moment that we rarely, if ever, have heard about. So to go through the rest of these folks, there's Bert Corona, a labor organizer that goes back to the 1930s and the founder of the Mexican-American Political Association in 1961. Jose Angel Gutierrez, one of the founders of the Mexican-American Youth Organization in Texas. Actually, almost all the founders of the Mexican-American Youth Organization went to Atlanta in that march. And Corky Gonzalez, who was the founder of Denver's Crusade for Justice. A one-time Democratic Party activist who became increasingly radical throughout the 60s. He actually headed the war on poverty in Denver for a while, but before becoming a radical spokesman for the Chicano movement. Peggy Terry from here in Uptown was there, along with other welfare rights activists, white, black, and brown. You had white coal miners from West Virginia who were interested in land and environmental issues. Peace activists, like the American Friends Service Committee, the activist arm of the Quakers. The National Council of Churches was represented. You had student activists. You had American Indians who were interested in fishing rights, being able to fish in ancestral waters that were supposedly protected by treaties, but then were violated over and over again, which is the story often of American Indians and their relationship with the federal government, as well as Puerto Ricans from Chicago and elsewhere. So you really had an interesting group of folks all in the same room, and here King presents his idea of the campaign, one that was not just about how SCLC defined poverty and the issues that they thought were important, but one that included everybody's ideas. King made his pitch for the radical redistribution of political and economic power. Participants recalled that much of the speech focused on a sharp but familiar critique of the nation's economic system in the Vietnam War, as well as the need for jobs or income for the nation's poor. But in a rare rhetorical gesture, King also discussed the denial of land as a source of people's poverty. Although his example focused on newly freed slaves in the Reconstruction South, such a reference also attempted to bind the cause of African Americans with those Mexican American and American Indian champions of land and treaty rights. Imploring the delegates to join what was now, quote, a human rights movement, King concluded that the nation has mixed up priorities and that we, quote, must think of the David of truth against the Goliath of injustice. The Poor People's Campaign was designed to get the nation right side up, he said. But it was only possible if the people in the room joined SCLC that spring. After King received modest applause, the bull session that followed showcased the anxious energy and unanswered questions of the activists present, not to mention the vastly different ways those present sought to combat poverty. Echoing the concerns of Jose Angel Gutierrez and others, Bert Corona asked, quote, do you want just our support or do you want our demands to include in the whole ball of wax? Corky Gonzalez characteristically was even more pointed, arguing that if King wanted to, quote, confer with Chicanos, he must understand that, quote, conferring is a two-way street. That included non-black representation in decision-making and policy-making, as well as the inclusion of their issues. Tia Arena repeated such concerns and then captivated the room with a fist-pounding, table-rattling, stem-winding defense of the land-grant struggle, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the distraction that debates about violence and armed self-defense posed. Quotes, quote, whites are afraid of their own crimes, he cried. They are not afraid of violence. The Liberty Bell cracked in rebellion against the betrayal of the aims of this country. He concluded by asking Ralph Abernathy, standing in for King that evening, if the civil rights leaders supported the treaty. Couching his answer slightly, an unsure Abernathy responded that they were, quote, with him in spirit, and the room exploded with applause. And for those of you who don't know what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is, it was the treaty that ended the U.S.-Mexican War in 1848, and that, which Tia Arena referred to over and over again as the reason why, and the legal justification why people of Mexican descent in New Mexico and southern Colorado had a right to the land that had been taken from them. So over the next several hours, the delegates bonded over food, over culture, and the growing realization that they had, that they were stronger together than they were apart. And perhaps more importantly, that SCLC took them seriously. Miles Horton, the founder of the Highlander Folk School, a long-time labor and civil rights organizing and training center in Tennessee back to the 1930s, wrote Dr. King after the conference, quote, I believe we caught a glimpse of the future and the making of a bottom-up coalition. So King was assassinated 3 weeks after this conference. And sparking violence in more than 100 cities, including here in Chicago. Chicago being actually one of the worst cities, along with Washington and my hometown of Baltimore. And here's a picture of from the Memorial March. Coretta Scott King in the middle, Ralph Abernathy in the light trench coat, Andy Young, Walter Reuther there. You see Bayard Rustin. Harry Belafonte, I think, is off. Is he there? He must be off the screen. So conventional wisdom would say that with his death, with Dr. King's death, that the Poor People's Campaign wouldn't have occurred. You know, of course it would have collapsed. Support for it would have collapsed. They wouldn't go forward with it. But Ralph Abernathy, King's successor, said, no, we're gonna move forward with this. And support, donations, volunteers for the campaign exploded in response. A lot of people who had initially said, I'm not going to be a part of this, just changed their minds. So there's this ironically, the campaign gets more support. There's more energy behind it. There's more enthusiasm for it after King's death than before. So that ranged from some of the Black Panthers I talked with, including Lauren Watson in Denver, who said that, I wanted to go as a tribute to Dr. King. We didn't always see eye to eye, but this is a tribute to this man's vision. Roy Wilkins, longtime rival of Dr. King's, the head of the NAACP, who had opposed the campaign as too provocative, too likely to provoke violence in Washington, said that he wouldn't support it, but he wouldn't oppose it either. And so he got out of the way. He didn't go, but he gave it his blessing in a lot of ways. And many other folks of black, brown, and white came out in support of the campaign in a way that they were maybe a little skeptical before him. So the campaign, as I said, was flooded with donations and volunteers to the point that it overwhelmed SCLC, an organization that was not necessarily known for its organization in the first place, right? And this becomes obvious in early May as the caravans that were going to bring thousands of marchers across the country to Washington, to live in Washington on the National Mall, those caravans started traversing the country. The most famous was the mule train. You can see here, this was the most photographed of all the caravans that went to Washington as part of the Poor People's Campaign. And it's a great the imagery is great here, right? It really captures poverty, but a particular kind of poverty, Southern poverty rooted in sharecropping. And this actually became one of the issues, and it's a central analytical part of my book, is the way the mass media, the mainstream media in particular, covered the campaign. Is that it didn't really talk about the multiracial makeup of the campaign. The Washington Post and the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and the daily newspapers and the networks didn't talk to Mexican Americans, didn't talk to Puerto Ricans, didn't talk to poor whites usually. It was portrayed as an African American civil rights campaign. African Americans are the majority of the group, are majority as part of the march, but King's vision and what Abernathy and the rest of the SCLC and the partners that went in with them during the campaign had strove for was a multiracial campaign that really was a transformation from civil rights to human rights. And this is something that the media does over and over again, and we see this in different ways. Another symbol that would end up distracting from the message of the campaign was Resurrection City. Here it is on the National Mall. This is West Potomac Park. It's now athletic fields for the most part. Depending on the season, it's softball or soccer fields. But in May, June, and July of '68, it became an encampment that held up to 2,500 people at its peak. And the plan had been always to have some sort of encampment where folks could live and use it as a launching pad, use it as a home base to lobby federal agencies, to lobby Congress, to lobby the White House. So the idea was to stay in Washington until America responds, to use King's words. And it was partly based, for those of you who are familiar with the history, partly based on the Bonus Army March of 1932, where you had thousands of World War I veterans descend on Washington and stay there demanding their bonus for fighting in World War I early. They were supposed to get it in 1945, but at the height of the Depression, or the depths of the Depression would be more appropriate, they marched on Washington. And at least for some of King's advisors, Stanley Levinson in particular, and others, they saw it as a model of a way of marching on Washington and making a point. Now, the Bonus Army March doesn't end very well. They're burned out by a young Douglas MacArthur, and Resurrection City doesn't actually end really any better. So Resurrection City takes on a life of its own, and it becomes a symbol, as I said, in both good ways and bad ways. Resurrection City had become home for almost 2,500 people at its peak in late May, described by one magazine as a, quote, revival meeting within a carnival within an army camp. Resurrection City took on a unique, throbbing personality through a rich diversity of people and a high level of creativity. Residents identified the grassy streets between tents with names such as Love Lane and Abernathy Avenue. Homes became the Sugar Shack, the Great Society, the Cleveland Rat Patrol, and Venceremos. Doctors with the Medical Committee on Human Rights made, quote, shanty calls. Barbers cut hair. Marshals tried to keep the peace. And many of those marshals were Blackstone Rangers, by the way. Children played in a daycare center named after Coretta Scott King, while men played checkers. If residents did not meet during periodic demonstrations at a federal agency or a meeting with a member of Congress, they saw each other for food or chemical toilets, in line for food or chemical toilets. A newspaper written solely by the camp's inhabitants, True Unity News, began to publish, and seemingly every night the entertainment was the, quote, finest in town. With freedom singers and revivalists, plus top-flight entertainers like Muddy Waters, Diana Ross, and Gladys Knight and the Pips, Resurrection City quickly became a renowned concert venue. The tent city even had its own zip code, 20013, in part to allow for residents' receipt of government benefits. Resurrection City witnessed intentional efforts to foster a sharing of different cultural styles and knowledge, particularly through the Many Races Soul Center and the Poor People's University. The Soul Center, located in the small so-called white section of Resurrection City, fostered intercultural exchange among the campaign's diverse participants, especially through music and dance. Coordinated by the Highlander Folk School, the Smithsonian Institution, and SCLC's Cultural Committee, the center organized activities ranging from historical discussions to live performances. While organizers sponsored some well-known folk artists such as Pete Seeger, of particular importance was finding musicians and artists from among the residents themselves, just as True Unity News inspired poetry and other writing by the residents. Quote, when the rain started, a shelter was built above the fire where coffee was always boiling and around which good conversation or singing was always taking place, wrote Miles Horton, who, as Highlander's founder, long had encouraged cultural understanding through music and art. Visiting entertainers found their way there for informal sing-alongs, from movement icon Bernice Reagan singing freedom songs to Miguel Barragan performing traditional Mexican ballads. The Soul Center hosted a daily symphony of sorts. Reagan, who helped found the SNCC Freedom Singers, recalled an evening at the Soul Center as one of her earliest moments of multiracial cultural exchange. I saw musicians relating and shifting their material because they were acknowledging the relationship between who they were and who somebody else was. So you may have noticed Miles Horton's mention of rain, and boy did it rain. As one person told me, one activist told me, it rained like in the Bible. It rained 19 out of 31 days at the peak of Resurrection City's existence in late May and early June. So you can imagine what this parkland may have looked like. Here's an example here on the left of the level of water that accumulated when it was raining. Here are some better days. Folks getting their hair cut. One of the white families from Appalachia. I think they're from, those folks are from Appalachia. So it rained so much that Resurrection City had to be evacuated at least twice. The mess hall collapsed. There were fears by the Medical Committee on Human Rights that a flu epidemic might break out. And when Coretta Scott King visited, she was literally carried by campaign officials throughout the encampment rather than let her walk through the ankle-deep mud. So by the time most Mexican Americans and American Indians had arrived by late May, because remember, for the most part, they're coming from the West Coast, and that they left a little bit later than some of the other caravans from the East Coast and the South did, and it just took a lot longer to get across the country, 3,000 miles. They didn't see what they had hoped to see in Resurrection City. In great understatement, Ernesto Vigil said, we didn't hope what we had hoped to see, clearly for understandable reasons. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. But we figured, well, okay, if they don't have their crap together, then we wish them the best of luck. Meanwhile, we have to get on with what we want to do during the time that we're here. So instead, most Chicanos, rather than living in Resurrection City, lived in the Hawthorne School, which was an experimental high school a couple miles away from the mall. And the choice of the Hawthorne was critical, I argue. It was there where a lot of the cultural exchange for Chicanos and a lot of the lessons and education that Chicanos received from their campaign experience. It took place there, to the point where several folks independently told me that the Hawthorne School was a successful multiracial community. And that's going to lead to my next excerpt here. So as the initial rain stopped, considerable multiracial cooperation began to blossom within the confines of the Hawthorne School. Sometimes this took the form of cultural exchange, such as the impromptu jam session Ernesto Vigil witnessed in a Hawthorne common area. A white man from Appalachia, quote, starts playing this kick-ass boogie-woogie on the piano, and all of a sudden, these poor white Appalachians were kicking their heels, black folks jump in, and Mexicans sit around tapping their toes, he recalled. You had an interesting cross-pollination. You can't structure that. Rudy Gonzalez, one of the Gonzalez's sons, found it invaluable in his later years to have played with kids of many backgrounds and ethnicities during their stay at Hawthorne. We had a blast, he recalled, but it also took some adjustment to interact with very poor whites. I had never seen poor whites before, he said. I mean dirt poor. Some hardly had shoes. And despite his young age, Rudy was not alone. Nearly all the Chicano activists interviewed echoed this sentiment. To them, whites were typically rich elites who suppressed the rights of others and ran the nation's power structure. They certainly were not more impoverished than them. But when the contingent from Appalachia arrived, Mexican Americans were shocked. I thought I was poor until I got there and saw some of these folks, said Roque Garcia from Santa Fe, who had grown up himself without indoor plumbing or a regular diet of meat. Gonzalez recalled that one initial response by the Mexican Americans there was to gather the extra shoes and jackets that they had brought for the trip and to give them to their white counterparts. Such interactions produced a more sophisticated way of viewing poverty. Corky and Jerry Gonzalez had been exposed to poverty of all kinds and knew, at least vaguely, about the rich organizing tradition of poor Appalachian whites. But it gave younger activists something to think about. It was the first time that a lot of us had any contact with Puerto Ricans, with Appalachian whites, recalled Ralph Ramirez of Los Angeles. When you never have been out of the state, never like even more than 100 miles from where you were born, to come in contact with all these people, these different cultures, these different subcultures, it was an education. For Carlos Montes, it helped crystallize some concepts. Quote, I went through a political change from what I would call a nationalist to a more international perspective, where I saw the struggle here at home. My rhetoric changed. Rather than vilifying white men, he began to criticize the capitalist structure more explicitly, and its most common defenders, rich white men, a change that would prove invaluable to him, first as an activist in the Chicano movement, and then as a labor organizer later on in the 70s and 80s. And this is one of the great takeaways of the campaign that I argue in the book, particularly for the Chicano participants of the march, is that they met people that got them thinking in a different way. A lot of these folks, I think it's important to note that the grand majority of the folks that went to the Poor People's Campaign were younger, teens, 20s, maybe early 30s. They were still, sort of learning about life and what other folks' experiences were like, getting out of their neighborhoods for the first time sometimes, getting out of their own towns, as Ralph Ramirez says, leaving, going somewhere more than 100 miles from home. A lot of the folks in New Mexico had never left New Mexico before, but they followed Tijerina to Washington to see what it was all about. And then that's where they met a lot of other folks. And so, as Carlos Montes told me, when would we have gotten together with the crusade, meaning the crusade for justice, lived with them, shared bread with them, marched every day with them? It's these activities that bonded Chicano activists together in such a way that they build on it when they return home. And in this sense, multiracial coalition led ironically to intra-racial solidarity. So one of the best-known protests from the Poor People's Campaign was outside the Supreme Court building. I referenced earlier the issue of fishing rights for American Indians. A lot of American Indians used actually direct action tactics, not unlike SNCC, not unlike many other grassroots organizations in the 60s, to challenge these laws. They would fish in places that they knew they're not supposed to do in violation of state laws to prompt their arrests, prompt publicity, and hopefully get a legal case that they could then defeat and get the Supreme Court's support, the court's support in knocking down these state laws. Well, the Supreme Court just a month before, in '68, said that no, the state laws were actually constitutional, and that the treaties that their ancestors had signed in the 18th and 19th centuries really didn't matter all that much. Now, that's changed not too long later in the early 1970s, but at this time they were fresh from a major defeat in the fishing rights, the issue of fishing rights. So some 400 African Americans, Mexican Americans, and American Indians got together to protest this court ruling. And it became a key moment, not just because of the protest itself, but what happens afterwards. After they have their say, after a delegation of them leads with meets with the clerk of the Supreme Court, they start marching back to the Hawthorne School and are attacked by the police. And several folks at the DC police officers try to run over or buzz by some Chicano kids. It starts a scuffle. Ernesto Vigil, Danny Tiarina, one of Reyes's sons, are arrested. And as Ernesto said to me, you really find common cause when you sit in the same goddamn jail cell. So they stay in the jail cell all day, and they come back to a crowd in the Vermont Street Baptist Church who celebrate them. And it's this sort of moment of unity that these protesters enjoy. Solidarity Day was, and this is a picture, it looks a lot like the March on Washington, and in some ways it was compared to the March on Washington by the media over and over again, much to its, usually in a negative way. The idea behind Solidarity Day was to have a climactic rally of 100,000 or however many people they could have. They had anywhere from 75 to 100,000 on the Washington Mall, and the featured speakers were Ralph Abernathy, Coretta Scott King, the United Auto Workers, Walter Reuther, and Peggy Terry. This is actually Peggy Terry's sort of probably biggest audience at one time, right here from uptown, speaking about the issues of poor whites, both in Appalachia and poor white migrants here in the north side of Chicago. And the rally, as I said, was often compared to its counterpart, but the media kept on talking about how there was not as many people there, the tone seemed to be different, it was angrier than it was in '63, that Ralph Abernathy was not as good of a speaker as Dr. King. Well, no kidding, I mean, but that's, Abernathy had his own style. And so what the focus on Solidarity Day, I mention it, if anything, to say that it wasn't really about this, right? Even though the media spent a lot of time focusing on this day and trying to make it into another March on Washington, really the importance and why the Poor People's Campaign was so illustrative and interesting was not a one-day rally, but the day in and day out of living together with each other, right? Going to marches and participating in mundane conversations, right? Whether it's just talking over coffee, as Miles Horton said. So 5 days after Solidarity Day, police come in and flatten Resurrection City. Now, to have this encampment on the Washington Mall, or on the National Mall, required a Department of Interior permit. And the Johnson administration decided the calculus, they knew about the Bonus Army March as well. They knew about how the Bonus Army March was terrible publicity for Herbert Hoover, and in a lot of ways sealed his defeat later on that year, in 1932. And so they said, to the point where Johnson aides are actually passing around histories of the Great Depression and Arthur Schlesinger's history of the Great Depression and the Hoover administration, and say, we don't want to do that. And even though we're a lame duck administration, we're going to allow them to do this for a while, and we'll allow them to have the rally, but then we'll pull the plug when we think it's necessary. So on June 24th, 1968, they do just that. Now, this is particularly interesting and has shaped my own work because most of the SCLC's records of the Poor People's Campaign were destroyed when this was knocked down. And so I had to spend a lot of time piecing together, reconstructing the story of the campaign, who was there, and the experience that folks had there by doing oral histories, by going to 20 archives, by mining mainstream and underground periodicals and newspapers, and spending a good bit of time with FBI files and the files of the Red Squad here in Chicago, who took very detailed notes about everybody who was part of every Poor People's Campaign meeting here in Chicago. And every organization that was a part of it. And you get a really good understanding. I mean, I will say, I mean, of course, this kind of surveillance is horrendous, but from a historian's perspective, sometimes the only one that kept a record was the undercover cop. And even though they had a particular lens that they were looking through, it was still valuable at in some ways. So most people went home after Resurrection City was knocked down. Some folks stayed around. But when folks went home, some felt defeated, but a lot of folks went home emboldened to take the fight to the authorities back home, to continue to fight for poverty with new partners, with new allies than they had before, whether that's other Chicanos or whether that was American Indian activists that they met, like Corky Gonzalez really starts tapping into American Indian activism and allies in Denver and other parts of the Rocky Mountains. Brought them to Denver to talk about their issues. Peggy Terry, of course, comes back home, runs for vice president on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket, which Mike knows quite a bit about. As a campaign manager, right? And LADO, the Latin American Defense Organization here in Chicago, talked about the unity that he saw both there and back here in Chicago between Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans that he saw developing during the Poor People's Campaign. And some folks even credit, and I think this is a stretch. Some people even tried to credit the Poor People's Campaign with the Rainbow Coalition of '69 that Fred Hampton was working. There were some connections between the two, but there's not a direct line between the two. But definitely some overlap. And behind the scenes, Marion Wright Edelman, Marion Wright, who's better known as Marion Wright Edelman, the founder of the Children's Defense Fund and National Welfare Rights Organization activists, were able to make inroads and make a lot of policy and bureaucracy connections in Washington that actually gave welfare rights activists a seat at the table, not just in the Johnson administration, but during the first years of the Nixon administration in '69 and 1970. And a lot of that had to do with the work during the campaign. So I would never argue that the campaign was some grand success. That's not my point. But it wasn't the Little Bighorn either. So the campaign overall takes up about half of my book. It's the heart of it and the heart and soul of it. But I try to contextualize the fight against poverty that the campaign represents with many of the other attempts and efforts at coalition building between African Americans and Mexican Americans, as well as whites and American Indians during the '60s. Whether it's Cesar Chavez and the Civil Rights Coalition that emerged in support of his fight in '65 and '66 in California, the efforts by a multiracial group of folks to support the boycotts, the great boycotts in '67 and '68, including here in Chicago, which was one of the best boycott cities when it came to shutting down the consumption of grapes in support of the farm workers. This was one of the most successful cities for a variety of reasons that we could talk about maybe during the Q&A. I also talk about Reyes Tijerina's efforts to reach out to black-powered advocates in California and elsewhere. And then I wrap up in Chicago with the '69 Rainbow Coalition, which was an interesting, fleeting coalition that occurred here that headed by Fred Hampton, Chacha Jimenez, and others. So I want to leave us with a couple of things to think about. I mean, why does this anti-poverty activism matter? It seems so remote. The Poor People's Campaign seems so remote to us today, I think, in a lot of ways because of the political culture that we live in today. They're making claims on the state. They're making claims on the federal government to intervene in a very federal, state-based way to alleviate poverty. And I have a picture up here of Occupy, and that wasn't quite what Occupy was doing. Occupy didn't quite have a lot of stated demands, but there's a reason why it's called Occupy Wall Street, right? They're making claims on the private sector as much, if not more so, than on the public sector, and I think that's a major difference between the two. So a couple of takeaways, though, that I have from the Poor People's Campaign that I make clear in the book is that just because a coalition is fleeting, that is not sustained over year after year after year, doesn't mean it's not productive, right? That even brief coalitions are important and can be substantive and can get things done. Two, the relationship between class and race. They're not always at odds with each other, and they often overlap, and folks can embrace an identity of being poor as well as a racial identity of some sort and work and operate in both circles and overlap. That is very obvious in the Poor People's Campaign. And then three, that when we think of the Black freedom struggle, it's not a struggle just for of optimism and brotherhood that was only about getting rid of the racial casteism of the South and desegregating lunch counters and restoring voting rights to African Americans who have been treated as second-class citizens for generations. But it was also a larger movement that made very hard demands about economic justice, about full opportunity and employment, and jobs, and education, and to be treated as full citizens. And I think the campaign captures that, as all this anti-poverty activism captures, and I think it's still a fight that we have today. Thanks so much.